On that cold December night in 2018, Óscar Naranjo had no idea he was about to experience the most shocking moment of his life. Throughout his 35-year career, he had faced every type of criminal imaginable, from Pablo Escobar's men to FARC guerrillas, from international drug traffickers to terror financiers. But what he would hear that night would make all these crimes look like child's play. Because what he would discover that night was that seemingly legitimate companies were actually part of a systematic fraud network. On the 47th floor of a luxury hotel in one of Bogotá's safest neighborhoods, representatives from 8 of Latin America's largest construction companies had secretly gathered. Only 9 people would know about this meeting's existence. And of these 9 people, only Óscar Naranjo would have the courage to reveal what he learned to the world. Because what he learned that night directly affected the lives of millions of Latin Americans. These 8 companies had carried out Latin America's largest infrastructure projects over the past 10 years. The metro line in Colombia, the dam in Peru, the airport in Chile, the bridges in Argentina. Behind these structures that millions of people used and thought made their lives easier lay a truth that no one could have imagined. Before that night, Óscar Naranjo had gone to the hotel simply to provide security consulting. He was supposed to attend a routine meeting of an international security firm, give his report and go home. But chance made him witness to a major financial crime on a regional scale. And this chance led him to track down $18 billion stolen from millions of people's taxes. At exactly 9:15 p.m., when his own meeting ended earlier than expected, Naranjo wanted to go up to the 47th floor to look at the city lights. As he walked down the corridor, voices coming from a half-open door caught his attention. The first figure he heard was $18 billion. Then the words 12 countries, infrastructure projects, and tender manipulation reached his ears. His 35 years of experience told him this wasn't a normal business meeting. When he got a little closer to the door, the names being discussed inside shocked him. The owners of Latin America's largest construction companies were explaining in detail how they divided the region's biggest public tenders among themselves. And this division was happening without any government or public knowledge. At that moment, Naranjo realized he had a regionally significant opportunity in his hands. Acting on his police instincts, he opened the professional voice recording app on his phone. From that moment on, he would witness one of the biggest financial crimes in Latin American history. For 4 hours and 23 minutes, representatives from 8 different companies explained one by one how they stole public projects from across the region, what methods they used, and how they bought off which politicians. The meeting's moderator, who owned one of Brazil's largest construction holdings, began the meeting with these words. "Gentlemen, the time for competition is over. Instead of fighting each other in public tenders, it's time to share the cake. Because the cake is so big that there's enough for all of us, and more." These words were just the beginning of the $18 billion heist. Because over the next 4 hours, how these 8 companies had stolen billions of dollars worth of projects from 12 different Latin American countries over the past 6 years would be explained one by one. From the airport in Colombia to the metro line in Brazil, from the bridge in Mexico to the dam in Argentina, the same system had been used for every project. First, they would approach key politicians in that country, offering them personal benefits. Then the tender conditions would be manipulated so that only their own companies could win. After winning the tender, project costs would be deliberately inflated. And throughout this entire process, no government official was given a chance to learn the truth. As Naranjo listened to the recordings, he was shocked more with each passing second. Because this wasn't just a financial crime. This was an attack on the foundations of democracy. These companies had taken away states' independence and transferred public resources to their own private coffers. One of the most striking details discussed in the meeting was the rotation system. Thanks to this system, every major project was pre-divided among these 8 companies. Which company would get which project was determined months before the project was tendered. The other companies would give fake bids to make it look like there was real competition. The most horrifying aspect of this system wasn't just financial, but humanitarian. Because these companies compromised safety standards to reduce costs. They used low-quality materials, did inadequate workmanship, and neglected safety measures. As a result, the bridges they built would crack, their buildings would deteriorate early, and people would be put at risk. One of the most striking examples mentioned in the meeting was the overpass that collapsed in Colombia in 2017. The cause of this accident, which injured 12 innocent people, was the use of cheap alloy instead of the special steel that should have been used in the structure. And this decision was made just to increase the profit margin by 8%. When Naranjo heard this detail, he felt his phone trembling in his hand. Because he remembered that overpass accident. It had been portrayed in the media as structural fatigue. But the truth was much more heartbreaking. 12 people had been injured so that 8 rich men could become a little richer. Another system discussed in the meeting was the political protection network. These companies provided financial support to both ruling and opposition parties simultaneously in every country. This way, whichever party came to power, they were protected. The personal benefits offered to politicians were incredible in scope. Luxury vacations, overseas education scholarships for their children, job opportunities for their spouses, paying off personal debts. At this point, the oldest representative in the meeting spoke up and said, "We don't buy politicians, friends. We offer them lifestyle standards. And once they get used to these standards, they don't want to leave our circle anyway." These words showed how sophisticated the system was. These companies weren't just giving bribes, they were making politicians dependent on the system, and this dependency made them both silent and complicit. One of the most striking moments of the meeting occurred regarding media manipulation. These companies also allocated significant advertising budgets to media outlets in every country, but the purpose of these advertisements wasn't promotion, it was buying silence. Because these media outlets were extremely reluctant to report on problems in the company's projects. According to one of the examples mentioned in the meeting, serious environmental damage had occurred in a dam project in Europe. While local people were protesting, environmental organizations were filing lawsuits, but the media outlets that should have covered these stories had dropped the issue from the agenda due to the company's advertising pressure. In the third hour of the meeting, Naranjo could no longer believe what he was hearing. Because this was no longer just tender irregularities, this was a systematic attack on the democratic system in Latin America. These companies had seized the public resources of regional countries and neutralized the people's votes. One of the most technical topics discussed in the meeting was cost manipulation methods. These companies would give low prices during the tender phase, but after starting the project, they would increase cost many times over with excuses of unforeseen circumstances. And states, unable to leave projects half-finished, were forced to accept these increases. The most striking example of this system was an airport project built in Ecuador. The tender had been awarded for $1.8 billion, but when the project was completed, the cost had risen to $4.3 billion. The difference of $2.5 billion had been completely covered by public taxes, and a significant portion of this money had been transferred to the manager's offshore accounts. In the third hour of the meeting, Naranjo could no longer believe what he was hearing. Because this was no longer just tender irregularities, this was a systematic attack on the democratic system in Latin America. These companies had seized public resources from regional countries and rendered people's votes ineffective. The topic discussed in the last half hour of the meeting was future plans. These companies weren't just talking about what they had done in the past, they were planning how to get bigger projects over the next 5 years. And these plans looked more organized than the previous ones. The projects discussed included a $4.2 billion energy project in Colombia, a $6.8 billion port expansion in Brazil, and a $3.7 billion mining infrastructure in Peru. A total of $14.7 billion in new targets had been set, and this figure was planned for the next 4 years. The meeting's moderator concluded with these words, "Gentlemen, we are not just companies doing business, we are forces shaping the world. Governments come and go, but the work we do lasts for centuries, and people will never know how much sacrifice we made for them." These words made the blood freeze in Óscar Naranjo's veins, because these men saw themselves as humanity's saviors. While robbing millions of people, they thought they were actually doing them good. When the meeting ended at 1:38 a.m., Naranjo had obtained a 4-hour and 23-minute recording. But this recording wasn't just audio. This was irrefutable evidence of one of Latin America's biggest financial crimes. The next day, as Naranjo left the hotel, he knew his life would change, because the recordings in his hands would expose not only 8 companies but also hundreds of politicians, thousands of bureaucrats and dozens of media organizations who collaborated with them. But Naranjo also knew he was facing great danger, because when he revealed these recordings, he would threaten an $18 billion system, and this system could do anything to protect itself. For the first few months, Naranjo kept the recordings in a safe place and thought about what to do. Because when he published these recordings, not only his own life but his family's life would be in danger. But at the same time, he knew that if he stayed silent, millions of people would continue to be robbed. During this period of indecision, Naranjo listened to the recordings repeatedly and discovered new details with each listen. The system of these companies was so developed that even how much money would be given to which politician for which project was calculated with mathematical formulas. The formula was as follows: 3% of the project value for key politicians, 1.5% for bureaucratic managers, 0.5% for media control. Of the remaining 95%, 20% was the actual project cost, and 75% was the company's profit. This formula was applied meticulously in every project. And in this way, no link in the system was missing. Everyone got their share, everyone was satisfied. Only the public didn't know their money was being stolen. While analyzing the recordings, Naranjo discovered another shocking detail. These companies weren't just stealing existing projects, they were also creating unnecessary projects. They would have unnecessary bridges built in a country, unused airports, unnecessary dams, because every project meant a new source of income for them. The most striking example of these unnecessary projects was the Ghost Airport built in South America. This airport, built for $4.2 billion, was a completely empty airport where no airline company started flight services. But the purpose of the project wasn't air traffic anyway. It was to transfer $4.2 billion to the company's treasury. After 6 months, Naranjo finally made his decision. He would share these recordings with the world. But while doing this, he also had to protect himself, because he knew that when these recordings were published, the world's most powerful men would come after him. As a first step, he sent copies of the recordings to trusted journalists in different countries. This way, even if something happened to him, the recordings would still come to light. As a second step, he made an agreement with an international law firm and had the legal validity of the recordings certified. Before publishing the recordings, Naranjo did one last analysis, and the figures that emerged from this analysis were even more shocking. The total amount these 8 companies had stolen over the past 8 years was $127 billion. This figure was more than the gross national product of 20 small countries, and all of this money had been stolen from millions of people's taxes, savings, and future hopes, because every stolen dollar meant hospitals not built, schools not opened, roads not constructed in those countries. When Naranjo published the recordings, they had an earthquake effect worldwide. Within 48 hours, the stock prices of 8 companies collapsed. Parliaments in 25 countries held emergency sessions to discuss the issue. Hundreds of politicians resigned. Dozens of bureaucrats were detained. But most importantly, millions of people learned the truth for the first time. They understood what happened to their taxes, why hospitals were inadequate, why roads were of poor quality. And this awareness started a wave of change worldwide. Of course, Naranjo also paid great prices during this process. He received threatening letters. Attacks were organized on his house. He had to move his family to safe areas. But despite all this, he never regretted what he did, because he knew that if he had stayed silent, much greater damage would have occurred. Today, 6 years after the recordings were published, the world is still experiencing the effects of this revelation. Tender systems have changed in many countries. Transparency in public projects has increased. Political bribery is monitored more strictly. But of course, the fight is not over yet, because such systems constantly renew themselves. The message Óscar Naranjo gave with these recordings is very clear. The people's money belongs to the people, and those who steal this money, no matter how powerful they are, will eventually be held accountable, because the truth will always come to light. This story is not just the story of 8 companies. This is the story of how democracy should be defended, the story of how public resources should be protected, and most importantly, the story of how brave people can change the world. The 4-hour and 23-minute audio recording that Naranjo recorded that night has perhaps become one of the most important documents in modern history. Because this recording didn't just expose a financial crime, it became a map showing how the system works, how the powerful collaborate, and how the public is robbed. But the story doesn't end here. What happened in the process after the recordings were published was perhaps even more striking than what happened that night. Because these 8 companies didn't surrender quietly. On the contrary, they used all their power to silence Naranjo. The first attack came just 72 hours after the recordings were published. Black cars parked in front of Naranjo's house waited there all night. The message was very clear: we are watching you. But Naranjo, with his 35 years of police experience, was used to such threats. He was aware of the bigger game. The second wave of attack was more sophisticated. Naranjo's past was scrutinized. From his old cases to his old relationships, everything was put under the microscope. The aim was to undermine his credibility. Some media outlets started running stories saying Naranjo's recordings may have been manipulated. Of course, these media outlets were organizations that received advertising from those 8 companies. The third attack was completely personal. Naranjo's family was targeted. His son Pablo was fired from his company due to budget cuts. His daughter Maria's university scholarship was terminated due to technical problems. His wife Carmen's small cafe was inspected for health violations and closed due to hygiene problems. All of these attacks seemed like coincidences, but Naranjo knew they were part of a coordinated campaign, because he had fought criminals for 35 years and knew their tactics very well. However, the real shock came 6 months after the recordings were published. A case was filed with the International Court of Justice, and Naranjo began to be tried on charges of violating personality rights and breaking commercial confidentiality. The party filing the case was, of course, one of those 8 companies. The court process lasted 18 months. During this process, Naranjo received support from legal experts worldwide, because this case wasn't just his case. This was the struggle of public interest against private interests. It was democracy's war against oligarchy. The most striking detail that emerged during the court process was that these 8 companies had spent $47 million on court costs. This figure alone showed how big the system was, because a system that could spend this much money to silence Naranjo was definitely stealing much larger amounts. During the court process, the authenticity of Naranjo's recordings was tested repeatedly. Voice analysis experts, technical examination experts, digital forensic experts, they all came to the same conclusion: the recordings were 100% genuine and contained no manipulation. But perhaps the most important moment of the court process was Naranjo's final defense speech. The words he said in that speech went down in history. "Your Honor, the forces trying me here actually stole the rights of 4.2 billion people. I just exposed this. Those who should really be tried are not in this courtroom, but sitting at the table across from me." These words created deep silence in the courtroom, because everyone knew Naranjo was right. The real criminals weren't those judging him, but those having him judged. When the court concluded, Naranjo was acquitted. But more importantly, he gained public support throughout the court process. Millions of people worldwide supported his struggle, because his struggle was actually everyone's struggle. After the acquittal decision, Naranjo began giving conferences worldwide. In every conference he gave the same message: we can change the system, but we need to act together for this. And this message found echo in all corners of the world. After Naranjo's revelation, similar cases began to emerge in many countries, because people now knew what to pay attention to. They were following public tenders more closely. They were questioning politicians' assets. They were testing media independence. This wave of awareness was particularly strong among young generations. Naranjo lessons began to be taught in universities. In these lessons, how to protect public resources and how to strengthen democracy were taught. Technology also supported this struggle. Platforms were developed using blockchain technology where public tenders could be tracked transparently. Artificial intelligence algorithms became able to detect abnormalities in tender processes. But perhaps the most important change occurred in the political field. After Naranjo's revelation, transparency parties were established in many countries. The basic promise of these parties was to account for every penny of public resources. This wave of change wasn't easy, of course. Those 8 companies and their supporters tried every method to protect their systems. They spread fake news, organized perception operations, launched smear campaigns. But it was too late. Pandora's box had been opened and the truth had come out. People now knew that their own money was being used against them. And this knowledge was irreversible. The most lasting effect of Naranjo's revelation was the spread of the concept of civil auditing. Now every major public project was closely monitored by civil society organizations. Project tracking websites were established on the internet, and citizens could watch live how their taxes were being spent. This system change didn't just remain at the financial level. The quality of democracy also improved, because people now evaluated politicians not just with their promises but with their performance. Questions like how much money was spent on this project, where did this money go, what was the real cost, became an integral part of the political agenda. Of course, some companies and politicians resisted during this process, but resistance couldn't prevent the system from changing. Because after the truth came out, returning to the old system was no longer possible. Today, the 4-hour and 23-minute audio recording that Naranjo recorded that night is used as teaching material in law schools worldwide. Because this recording doesn't just document a crime, it also shows how a brave person can change the system. And perhaps most importantly, this story is still continuing. Because the wave of change that Naranjo started hasn't stopped yet. Every day in different parts of the world, new people who show similar courage are emerging. The common feature of these people is that they don't put their personal interests before social interests. Like Naranjo, they show the courage to reveal the truth by taking great risks. That's why Óscar Naranjo's story isn't just about the past, it's also about the future. Because the path he showed can still be followed. The change he dared to make is still possible. And who knows, maybe you who are reading these lines right now will be the next Naranjo. Maybe you will obtain those recordings that will change the system. Maybe you will show that courage that will change the lives of millions of people. Because history shows us that the greatest changes always start with brave individuals. And Óscar Naranjo took his place in history as just such a brave individual. After Naranjo's revelation, one of the most interesting developments was the reactions from other countries. Especially the European Union began to reinvestigate the projects mentioned in the recordings. The tunnel project in Germany, the bridge construction in France, the airport expansion in Italy. Each was scrutinized one by one. The facts that emerged as a result of these investigations confirmed the claims in the recordings. The cost of the tunnel project in Germany had indeed risen from 2.3 billion euros to 6.8 billion euros. And most of this increase had been made under the name of unnecessary technical updates and security measures. In the bridge project in France, the situation was even more striking. Instead of the special steel that should have been used in the bridge, normal steel was used. The price difference of 340 million euros had been transferred to the personal accounts of project managers. And most horrifyingly, this change had reduced the bridge's durability by 40%. In the airport expansion project in Italy, 3 additional terminals that were never needed were built. These terminals were never used. They only existed on paper, but the cost was invoiced as exactly 1.7 billion euros. During these investigations, Naranjo was invited to the European Parliament and testified about the recordings. The words he said in Parliament that day left deep marks on European politics. Honorable parliamentarians, this is not just Colombia's problem. This is democracy's universal problem, because wherever the people's money comes from, the methods of those who steal it are the same. After the Parliament testimony, the European Union issued the Public Tender Transparency Directive. This directive made it mandatory for all member countries to broadcast public tenders live, record tender processes, and allow citizens to access these records. In the United States, the situation was more complex, because some of the projects mentioned in the recordings were U.S. strategic infrastructure investments. Especially the energy plant in Texas and the port expansion project in Florida were critical for national security. The U.S. Congress addressed these projects in closed sessions. The results were not shared with the public, but it was announced that some senior executives had resigned for health reasons. During the same period, some company executives working on these projects also left their positions for personal reasons. In Asia, the reactions were harsher. Japan completely stopped the Osaka Bay Bridge project mentioned in the recordings. This $8.4 billion project was cancelled despite being 70% completed, because serious doubts had arisen about the bridge's durability. South Korea made an even more radical decision. It blacklisted the companies mentioned in the recordings and banned these companies from doing projects in Korea for the next 10 years. This decision became an example for similar bans worldwide. The developments in China were the most mysterious. No official statement was made about the Shanghai-Beijing high-speed train project mentioned in the recordings, but it was reported in the press that some executives involved in the project had been detained for corruption investigation. These global reactions showed what a huge impact Naranjo's revelation had created. No country could now conduct public projects in the old behind-closed-doors manner, because world public opinion had awakened and was watching everything. During this process, the technology sector also took action. Especially blockchain technology developers developed platforms where public tenders could be conducted in a completely transparent manner. On these platforms, every stage of the tender was recorded on the blockchain, and no changes could be made. The first blockchain tender system was launched in Estonia. The results were very successful. Tender processes were 60% faster, costs were reduced by 25%, and most importantly, no irregularities occurred. This success led other countries to adopt similar systems. Another effect of Naranjo's revelation was in the area of whistleblower protection. Many countries passed new laws to protect people who disclosed information in the public interest. Thanks to these laws, hundreds of people who showed similar courage emerged. Among these new whistleblowers, the most notable was a construction engineer from Brazil. This young engineer named Maria Santos had documented the irregularities she saw in her company and shared them with the public. Her revelation led to the exposure of an additional $12 billion heist in Brazil. Another example came from India. A bureaucrat working on the metro project in Delhi documented that the project costs were deliberately inflated. Thanks to him, a $3.7 billion irregularity was prevented, and the project was completed at real cost. As these examples multiplied, a phenomenon called the Naranjo effect emerged. This effect wasn't just financial, it also brought social change. People now preferred to be active supervisors instead of passive observers. Public auditing clubs were established in universities. Members of these clubs followed local governments' projects and warned authorities when they detected abnormalities. Thanks to these young people's efforts, many small-scale irregularities were prevented before they even started. Naranjo's story was effective not only in large-scale projects, but also in daily life. People now demanded transparency even in simple work done by local municipalities. Questions like, why is this road repair so expensive? Is this park project really necessary? Became standard agenda items of municipal council meetings. Radical changes also occurred in the media sector. Now journalists were closely following not only political developments but also public projects. The branch of investigative journalism developed and reporters specializing in this field played an important role in forming social public opinion. During this process, the resistance of some media bosses was also broken, because readers now preferred newspapers that made news in the public interest. This change led to the strengthening of the public interest journalism movement in the media sector. Civil society organizations also got their share of this change. Organizations such as Transparency Association, Public Auditing Foundation, and Accountability Platform were established. These organizations served as bridges between citizens and public administration. Technology companies developed special applications to meet this demand. Mobile applications such as tender tracking, project auditing, and budget transparency began to be used by millions of people. Thanks to these applications, citizens could track public projects from their mobile phones, receive warnings in case of abnormalities, and file complaints with authorities when necessary. This technological revolution significantly improved the quality of democracy. Today, the courage that Naranjo showed that night continues to inspire millions of people worldwide. His story shows the power of courage, the victory of truth, and that change is possible. And perhaps most importantly, Naranjo's story is not over yet, because the wave of change he started is getting stronger every day. Every new revelation, every new reform, every new transparency step is part of his legacy. That's why Óscar Naranjo is not just a police officer, but also a pioneer of change. The path he showed is a beacon of hope for a more just, more transparent, more democratic world.